Hello and welcome to Chapter 12. This chapter, we are going to review all the criteria, all the different disorders in more of a general way than we have for some of the other chapters. This chapter, is on substance-related and addictive disorders. Now, this chapter in the DSM breaks everything down to specific substance-related disorders related to specific substances or categories of substances. And so we will go over those. If you want to learn more about this area, I also teach a class called Drugs and Human Behavior. I teach that one online also. It's a 100 level course, but we do really go into each of these different categories of drugs, okay? For this chapter, we're really just going to review kind of how to categorize things, but not learn a ton about each substance, because clearly I can go on and on about each one. Okay. So there's some vocabulary here, and this is going to be a piece of things that you want to study, okay? So substance use disorders. This is how we categorize these disorders now, as substance use disorders. So they will be alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, tobacco use disorder, blah, blah, blah. In the DSM-4, this was broken down into more specific categories. And what we found was that people didn't necessarily just fit into this one or just fit into that one, and more of a spectrum of substance use disorder made more sense as far as categorization goes. Okay, so substance. A substance is a chemical. It alters a person's mood, or it alters a person's behavior when it is either smoked, injected, drunk, inhaled, swallowed, etc., etc. Okay? So it is, any kind of chemical that alters a person's mood or behavior. Now, we have these two terms, and one is abuse and one is dependence. And again, in the DSM-4, we categorized people into substance abuse, substance dependence, and now we just call it substance use disorder. And then we're going to talk a bit more about abuse and about dependence. So, substance abuse is this maladaptive pattern of use of the substance. Okay, this maladaptive pattern must occur within a 12-month period and lead to significant impairment or significant distress. So that is, it causes problems with their family or job or social life, right? So this is not necessarily, not that it's a good idea for a college student to get real drunk. It's actually a really bad idea. However, if a college student gets real drunk once every several months and doesn't have any adverse consequences, we don't necessarily call it abuse because it has to be causing some sort of impairment or distress. Now, if a mom who's home with their kids during the day gets real drunk during the day every couple months, we say, wow, this is a problem. This is abuse. This is a substance use disorder, because you shouldn't be real drunk while taking care of your kids. That could cause some significant impairment or distress within your relationship and with the safety of your children. That should be a no-brainer, but I hope that that kind of gives you an example of when we're going to call it abuse with that impairment and when we're going to say, hey, this was probably a bad call on your part, but we're not going to give it a disorder categorized name. Okay? Now, the next term here we have is substance dependence. Okay, so dependence is a maladaptive pattern of use, right? Manifested by cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms. Okay, and often we really talk about those physiological or physical symptoms, but we also want to acknowledge the cognitive and behavioral symptoms during a 12-month period that is caused by continued use of a substance. Okay, so that is maybe, I am using alcohol and I know that it is impairing hurting my liver, and I've gone to the doctor and they've told me that my liver is very bad and that, if I continue on this pattern that I may need to be hospitalized. And in spite of that information, I still continue to use heavily. Okay. When we talk about a substance like cannabis or marijuana, we, don't necessarily look at those physiological symptoms. We may look more at the cognitive or behavioral symptoms. So, I really feel compelled to stay home and smoke weed all day, and I feel compelled to do nothing else because I'm using it in order to kind of check out of life. And the idea of not using it makes me feel miserable emotionally. Okay, so therefore I continue using it even though I'm not going to class and even though I am just sitting around with friends all day getting high. Okay, so that would be behavioral, dependence on that. Okay, again, I'm just giving you this brief overview, so that does not explain everything, but hopefully you get generally an idea there. Okay, a few more vocabulary words here. We have withdrawal, we have tolerance, and substance intoxication. Okay, I'm going to jump to the bottom here. And intoxication would be that temporary maladaptive experience of behavioral or psychological changes that are due to the accumulation of a substance in the body. That is a lot of words to say what intoxication means. I think this is one that you guys actually just know what it means, right? It's when you're drunk. It's when you're high. That is that. You have had enough that you are showing changes, behavioral or psychological, because you have put that substance in your body. Okay, let's jump back up. And sorry, I have little sniffles today. You'll have to deal with that. There we go. So withdrawal. This is our physiological or psychological changes that occur when you stop taking the substance. Okay, so I drink, I stop drinking, and the next day I feel miserable. With alcohol, if you're a heavy drinker and you drink regularly for a long time and you stop, your withdrawal symptoms can be things like seizures and other really dangerous things. You may, though, recognize what withdrawal feels like if you are somebody who has smoked cigarettes and then had to stop. Okay, so that's withdrawal, is when you stop and you have adverse consequences. Tolerance. Tolerance is the extent to which the individual requires larger and larger amounts of substance in order to achieve the desired effects. Or sometimes we say that if they take the same amount, they no longer feel those effects over time. Okay, so therefore you'd have to take it in higher amounts to get that same effect. Right? So, or to the extent of which individuals feel less of its effects after using the same amount of substance. We say it in these two different ways, means the same thing. Okay, and this is the, okay, when I was younger, I would drink a, wine cooler and be wasted. And then as I continue to drink, I now have to drink a fifth of tequila in order to get that same effect. Of course, we hope you don't get to that point, but you get my point. That's tolerance. So withdrawal, tolerance, intoxication. Now, this is what I'm saying is we have this called substance use disorder category here. This is a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms indicating that the individual continues using a substance even though it causes significant problems in his or her life. Okay, so if you know you need to get a job and you know those jobs are going to drug test you, but you continue to use drugs knowing that this is going to cause problems in your life, right? You refuse to stop using even though you know that that would benefit you. So clinicians diagnose substance use disorders by assessing the individual in 4 categories here. We assess impaired control. That is, you're unable to stop when you want to stop. You drink, let's go with drinking. You drink more than you wanted to. You said, okay, I'll meet you out for 1 drink, and like 7 drinks later, you're still out. Or you say, I'm only going to stay for an hour, and 7 hours later, you're still out. Okay. Social impairment. That is either you're acting like an idiot out in social situations, or people have stopped wanting to spend time with you, or people have asked you to stop using and you continue using. Risky use, so using in situations that are unsafe or using to the extent that you know it's unsafe. And pharmacological changes, and that is that you notice that you have the tolerance happening, you experience withdrawal effects, you continue using anyway, and then there's other kinds of things that happen, changes in your brain, things like that. Okay. This new diagnostic term has fewer negative connotations than the term addiction. So people always talk about, oh, you're addicted to this, you're addicted to that. The term addiction is not a diagnostic term. It's a descriptor that people use. Sometimes they use it in research. Sometimes they just use it sort of in social conversations. But the term that we use here is substance use disorder. So let's talk briefly about some specific substances. You don't need to know these percentages. That is, you don't have to memorize these percentages, but some things for you to know. 24.6 million Americans use some kind of illegal drug at least once in the past 30 days. Marijuana is the most commonly used illegal drug, and I'll say this. There are areas where marijuana is becoming legal, whether it's medicinally or recreationally. We still consider this when doing national studies an illegal drug because technically, federally, it is still illegal, okay? Rates of current illegal drug use vary considerably by demographic group, right? Some demographic groups use this type of drug. Some, meth is really popular with some, and cocaine is really popular with others, and marijuana is really popular with others. The rates of illegal drug use generally decline linearly with age. So the peak of 23% is at ages 18 to 20 and declines way down to 2% at ages 65 and older. Right? Now, part of that is some of the people that are using some of those illegal drugs don't make it to 65. But the other reasons are just because risk-taking behavior goes down. Okay, and at the end of this one, I did say think critically based on what I said before, and that is that marijuana has become legal in a lot of places, and so use has gone up in those places, or at least people that are willing to admit that they use has gone up. However, we still include it in these percentages. So between the years of 2013 and 2014, the rate of illegal drug use in the past month increased from 5.7 to 8.9%, which is a statistically significant increase. But I don't like to use these kinds of data to jump to, oh my gosh, we have a drug epidemic, okay? People have used illegal drugs. People are using the illegal drugs. There's a lot of issues with that. However, there are different issues with different types of drugs. Blah, blah, blah. Think critically about any stats you see. Okay. Substance abuse. Most drugs of abuse directly or indirectly target the reward center of the brain, okay? It floods the brain circuits with dopamine, right? So we get this rush of, oh my gosh, that feels so good. I like that. I want that. We've talked about dopamine before when we've talked about other disorders, and we've talked about dopamine as that reward system. It makes us feel really good. We talked about it we should have talked about it in one of the eating disorder discussions, and that is that binge eating and purging actually lights up those same dopamine circuits, okay? Overstimulation of this reward system produces that euphoric effect that abusers seek. It leads them to repeat the behavior in order to repeat the experience. So when you have trials with, let me say it this way, if you want to know if a substance is, quote, addictive or not, you give it to rats or mice and you allow them to push a lever and get it again. And things that are more addictive to the brain, those rats will start to choose. If they have two levers and they can either choose food or they can choose the drug, they're going to start picking the drug every time, okay? Because that reward feeling of dopamine in their brains is even better than feeding themselves in order to survive. Okay, here's a picture. This is just simply, is dopamine, right? So all drugs of abuse target this brain's pleasure center. Okay, it goes around here. This is where we see it light up when we do brain scans. Now, eating food, yay, dopamine. Drugs, yay, dopamine. Okay, cocaine specifically, lots of dopamine release, and then cocaine actually kind of prevents, if you see these orange balls, as though this is what it really looks like, these little orange or whatever color you see, balls here block the dopamine reuptake, so the dopamine stays down here and like dances for a long time. Okay. So what in the world happened? What did I do? There we go. I did the wrong thing. Okay. Comorbidity for substance use and psychological disorders. So feel free to take a moment to look at this, but we have people who, just all respondents, people that have any mood disorder, and people who have any anxiety disorder, how likely they are to use these different drugs. Now, these are correlational studies, not causational studies. So it's not necessarily that the depression or bipolar disorder is causing them to use these. It is also not the drug that is causing the disorders, but we do see these correlations. Okay, alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant. Okay, things to know. Alcohol is a depressant. It's a psychoactive substance that causes the depression of the central nervous system activity. And that's what we mean by depressant. We don't mean it makes you feel depressed in your brain. It makes you breathe slower and your heart rate to slow down. It's sedating. It's a central nervous system depressant. It is a drug that is intensely dangerous to your body when taken in larger amounts and over a longer period of time. This one can kill you for sure if, again, taken in larger doses and over a long period of time. Okay. Potential compounding of these effects, and that is if you use alcohol in combination with some other depressant. This is why it's so dangerous to use alcohol and take pills at the same time. Certain pills, you know what pills I'm talking about, because this is going to depress your respiratory system, and those are going to depress your respiratory system, and you may just stop breathing. Just stop. That's it. Just not breathe anymore. Which may not be the effect you were going for. Okay. Long-term effects. Permanent brain damage, right? We need oxygen in our brains. This can, again, not getting oxygen to our brains is a bad thing with lower respiratory stuff. there's also these dementias. So we have Wernicke's disease, and that's going to cause some issues with speech impairment. Korsakoff's is a big one that we want to talk about. Some people call it Wernicke's-Korsakoff's, but Korsakoff syndrome is really what we see when somebody has been using alcohol over a long period of time. So they have used or they have abused alcohol for a long period of time. What we see is there are certain vitamins that we need, thiamine, that needs to get to your brain. If you are drinking alcohol regularly to the point where you're not really consuming the foods that you need, then it starts to kill your brain. What's interesting with this type of a dementia is that people are so committed to their alcoholism that they will start to, the word is confabulate, but they start to make things up and they start to forget things, but then they make things up to go in place of those. And then they stick to those lies like, well, their life depends on it, right? So they will tell somebody something that's happened that didn't happen at all, but then they will swear that's right. Somebody might ask them something that just happened and they don't remember. So it is a dementia. It is a problem with memory. But the person starts kind of making things up to fill in so that people don't really notice how bad off they are. Okay. We also have harmful changes in the liver, the gastrointestinal system, bone density, muscles, the immune system. If you've ever seen anybody dying from chronic alcohol use, usually they have that sort of distended abdomen. So that is that their belly sticks out, but the rest of them does not. Sometimes this happens just with long-term alcohol use. Doesn't mean they're necessarily dying of it, but when you do see somebody that is dying of it, that is there. You also see people become sort of a jaundice, and that is kind of a yellow color. It's not a good look, and it's really sad. But I think it's important for you to know that these things are very dangerous, right? If you are someone who chooses to use alcohol, please do so in a responsible way. Please monitor yourself. Please make sure that, on a regular basis, you challenge yourself to make sure that you are not dependent on alcohol, to make sure that you're totally cool and can handle not drinking for a few days, or that you can handle drinking only one drink. One drink means actually one drink, not like one giant mug of alcohol. To check in with yourself. Okay? That's just my thought. All right. So, theories and treatments of alcohol dependence. We do have some genetic links. That is that we do see it running in families. With medications, we may use things like naltrexone. This one is also known more as like antabuse is the term that people would think of. I'm not as familiar with this medication. I'd have to look more into that one. So we'll move on. How about that? Treatments, we're going to have cognitive behavioral treatments. Those are used very commonly. Motivational interviewing is really a fabulous thing, but that's with a therapist. It's kind of a one-on-one, typically, motivational interviewing. Expectancy manipulation, relapse prevention. So expectancies, my husband does some research in expectancies. They are these if-thens. So the idea is that if I'm feeling stressed and I have a drink, I will feel better. But actually, if we kind of think about it, often I talk about this with clients, often if we're having a really bad day and we're feeling really, really upset about something and we start drinking to make us stop thinking about it, we end up drinking to the point where we think about it more and it becomes more upsetting and we actually end up kind of worse off. And if we can sort of realize that, we maybe don't make the decision in the first place to go down that path. That's just one kind of expectancy manipulation. There's lots of others. With motivational interviewing, one of the things we may do is say, okay, let's talk, you like drinking, fine. Like maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's okay, right? So it's not causing any problems in your life, right? Oh, it is. Okay. Well, I mean, they're not that bad. Well, oh, they are? Oh, okay. Well, let's talk about pros and cons. So you make a grid of pros of continuing your use and cons of continuing your use, and then pros of stopping and cons of stopping. And I think it's important to really talk about the positives that you get out of use. We don't want to say like, well, everything's bad, because if it was all bad, why would you have ever been using, right? We need to be realistic about the pros and the things that it does provide for you. And if you're going to stop, we've got to find some other things to put in place here. And that brings us to relapse prevention. And relapse prevention is going to be things like increasing social support, maybe having friends that are not the same friends that you always like got wasted with. Doing simple things like if you always sat in the same place on your couch and just drank, like moving your furniture around. I know this seems ridiculous, but just simply like adjusting things so you're not just in that same habit actually seems to help a lot. I will say one thing about AA here, and that is, our founders of AA, Bill W. and such, they had fabulous intentions with the program that they came up with. It was really based on people believed that people who use substances were bad people. And then AA came out to say, hey, that's not true. You have a disease. You're not a bad person, but you can't drink. Okay. Now, some people, we can use something called contingency management, and they can actually learn how to drink appropriately. But for other people, AA seems like a better model. For some people, not for others. So does AA work? Here's what the research shows. If you want AA to work and you buy into their principles and you like it, then it will work. If you don't want to go and you don't like it and you are mandated to go, it doesn't help at all. Okay? So it's one of those things that it works if you want it to, but when you mandate people to do this type of treatment, it doesn't usually go that well. Cognitive behavioral interventions, motivational approaches, those things seem better. Expectancy manipulation, relapse prevention, those seem to work best. And really, a combined intervention, as you can imagine, is ideal. Let's talk about other substances. Stimulants. Stimulants are going to have that stimulating effect on our central nervous system. We have amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine. Okay. With methamphetamines, if you haven't been in one of my other classes, I challenge you to go to Faces of Meth. I think it's .org. I won't take you there now. But facesofmeth.org, you scroll down, I think, to the bottom to get in, and then you kind of scroll over these different faces, and it shows you what they looked like before and then what they look like after using meth. I think it's a pretty good motivator to not use meth. I can give you pros and cons of different drugs. I got nothing good for meth, right? Meth is a nasty, will most likely mess up your life kind of drug. Okay, I won't harp on that anymore. We'll move on. These are different stimulants. Cocaine, crack cocaine goes along with this, amphetamines. Okay, next we have cannabis or marijuana. Your book talks about hashish also, which is, also part of the cannabis plant. Marijuana is the most commonly used illegal drug in the U.S. 70% of first-time drug users choose marijuana, often because it's accessible. It's something that, it's not like you don't have to snort it. You just, smoking it typically is how people use it the first time. Accessibility is a big piece here, though. A lot of people like to talk about marijuana as a gateway drug. Using marijuana doesn't make you want to go then use other drugs. It's just simply that people that are going to go on to use other drugs typically start with marijuana. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Cannabis does affect your executive functions, and frankly, you should not be driving if you're using marijuana. Attention and concentration, generally impaired for people that don't use all the time. Some people that use all the time, they don't seem to notice these impairments anymore. These types of things with residual effects and long-term effects are really different for different people, and different studies show different things. Things are usually shown to either not have long-term effects or to have mixed findings. Okay. However, decision-making and risk-taking. Acute effects, again, mixed findings. We do seem to see that people that have used a lot of marijuana have impaired residual effects for decision-making and risk-taking. However, I will say that this may be that the type of person that is going to have impaired functioning here is also the type of person who is using more heavily when it comes to this type of a drug. Inhibition, impulsivity, working memory, verbal fluency, depends on at what dose you're using this type of drug. Okay. Yes, it grows out of the ground. Yes, it's legal in some places. Yes, it most likely doesn't have terrible long-term effects like other drugs. Having said that, it is still a drug. It does still cause impairment in things, whether that's acute impairment or possibly longer term. Please make sure that you make good decisions. If this is a drug that somebody chooses to use, as always with everything, make sure that you are in a safe environment. Make sure that you are not going to get arrested. Make sure that you're not going to drive a car or any kind of heavy machinery. To all of those kinds of things. And again, it's a drug. It's Alabama. Don't use drugs. Drugs are illegal. Moving on. Hallucinogens. So we categorize this, we meaning the DSM categorizes all of these drugs together as hallucinogen-related disorders or hallucinogen-related use disorder, intoxication. You don't really have withdrawal effects from a lot of these. Now, LSD, peyote, and psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, those are your classic hallucinogens, okay? These function very similarly. Ayahuasca is going to be put into this category. They're going to have slightly different effects, and there's lots of other hallucinogens that are offshoots of LSD. These are sort of classic hallucinogens. PCP is a whole different thing. Most people do not enjoy PCP, ketamine, those types of dissociative deliriants. Sometimes cough syrup is put into this category here. MDMA is ecstasy. That's also going to have a different kind of effect. The concern with MDMA, so these drugs, you are highly unlikely, especially with psilocybin, highly unlikely to be able to physically harm yourself by using these drugs. You may be unhappy. You may have an unpleasant experience mentally. You may put yourself in a situation that's dangerous and you could hurt yourself that way, but the actual drug is not going to physically harm you. This drug could affect your brain, definitely could. And MDMA causes problems with serotonin. So sometimes people see this serotonin rebound syndrome. People call it different things. But basically, the day after you use, Okay, this is with ecstasy. Basically, it wears out your serotonin receptors. And as we know from the depression chapters, serotonin is a big piece of our mood functioning, right? So when you have MDMA, it's kind of wearing them out, if you want to say that. And so sometimes the next day or next week or next month, people feel really depressed because they wore this area out. They wore out their serotonin, to put it in a completely unscientific terminology there. So if you know somebody who used ecstasy or MDMA who is now thinking the world is going to, end and everything is terrible, and does love really exist and all these things, you can say, hey, I think you're having basically, quote, withdrawal-like stuff from using the ecstasy. Will you wait this out before you decide that the world is over? And usually that subsides and they go back to it, to feeling their normal self. But I mean, it can be miserable for a while. So again, not recommending any drugs. Don't take drugs. MDMA definitely could cause some problems the next day. These things can be unpleasant while you're taking them. If you're interested in more information on some of these things, my husband Peter Hendricks does research over in the Department of Public Health with this particular drug. And I do write magic mushrooms on here so that you know what that word is. Psilocybin. Actually, hallucinogens have gotten a lot of press and a lot of attention for a lot of the science around it in the past couple of years. There's a lot that comes out of Johns Hopkins and other places. Okay, moving on. Opioids. Yay. Okay. Opioid is a substance that relieves pain. Okay. The term, if you know the term endorphins are a natural thing that we have in our body. And the word endorphin means endogenous morphine, right? Endorphin, endogenous meaning internal morphine, which is an opioid. So it's basically our internal opioids. When we have opioid-related disorders, use, intoxication, withdrawal, we're usually looking at these particular kinds of drugs. Hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, codeine, heroin. Okay? If you are addicted to painkillers, you are basically using heroin. Do not think that this is better. That doesn't mean go use heroin. That means this is a problem. Okay? Technically, these are legal if you are prescribed them legally. They are wildly overprescribed in the US. Some people really benefit from them. Other people use them recreationally. They can cause a lot of problems in your life. Okay, that was weird. All right, so just looking at unintentional drug overdose deaths. Unintentional drug overdose deaths. We're going to have our opioids. Oh no. We have our cocaine. And we have our heroin. You always hear about this heroin epidemic, right? I'm not saying that it's not a problem. Heroin is a problem. But the issue we have even more so are these, quote, legal opioid medications that people take as pill form. Some people crush them up. Some people chew them up. Some people snort them. Some people inject them. But I'll have people say to me, but I'm not using heroin. I'm just snorting and injecting pills that are the same thing as heroin. Okay. Along these lines, by the way, way down off the charts here, way down is going to be, actually maybe not on the chart at all or anywhere at all, is going to be our LSD, our psilocybin, our marijuana. We just don't see drug overdose deaths. when there were some issues with LSD a long time ago, it's because they weren't actually just getting LSD. People were getting LSD in combination with some other things. And those other things were causing problems. Okay. Sedative, hypnotics, and anxiolytics. So sedatives have a calming effect on the nervous system. They induce sleep. Anti-anxiety medications also go into this category. These are our benzodiazepines and our sleep aids. Okay. Caffeine. Caffeine is found in coffee, tea, a little bit in chocolate. If you take my class, you'll learn about xanthines in general. Caffeine is one of those. Chocolate has a lot of a different kind of xanthine. Energy pills, diet pills, headache remedies. They, they increase the individual's perceived level of energy and alertness, and they increase blood pressure. Okay, it may lead to increases in body's production of cortisol, but that's generally caffeine. We don't see a lot of negative effects due to caffeine if you use it in moderation. If you use caffeine in excessive amounts, and I mean excessive amounts, then we do start to see some issues. However, if you're drinking like 5 pots of coffee a day, there's a chance you already have some other issue. Okay. Tobacco. Nicotine is a psychoactive substance found in cigarettes. It stimulates the release of adrenaline and norepinephrine. It increases blood pressure, heart rate, and respiration. Individuals can be diagnosed with tobacco use disorder, tobacco withdrawal, but not necessarily tobacco intoxication. Okay. So we talked about stimulants and we talked about depressants. Tobacco is actually one of these that has what we call biphasic effects, and that is it has stimulating and depressive effects at the same time. It's one of these reasons why it's probably one of the most difficult, I don't know exactly where it falls, but people say the most difficult, but I don't know for sure, substance to stop using. Withdrawal happens almost immediately, within 30 minutes of your last, use of nicotine. And that's hard. I mean, it's physically difficult to stop using cigarettes. And then often after people stop using, because they've been using for psychological reasons, not just physical reasons, the next time something stressful happens, if they don't have a plan in place, people tend to go back to smoking. People who haven't smoked, who have emphysema, after something stressful happens, they go back to smoking. You'll see people with oxygen, carrying around oxygen with them outside of a hospital smoking cigarettes. It's an intense thing to stop. Ideally, you never start. And then you don't have to deal with having to quit. Okay. Just to go on to here, nicotine is also the active ingredient in vaping also. Okay, so if you are someone who vapes, you are still addicted to nicotine. We don't know the long-term effects of that. We assume that it's better than smoking cigarettes, but we don't know that yet because it hasn't been around that long. Okay. Inhalants. Inhalants are a diverse group of substances. They cause psychoactive effects by producing chemical vapors. Inhalants have similar effects to alcohol. Do you want to know that? They have similar effects as alcohol. Slurred speech, loss of coordination, euphoria, dizziness, and over time, this kind of loss of inhibition and loss of control. Okay? We have our volatile solvents, our aerosols, our gases, and our nitrates. Nitrous oxide is a trendy one. You fill up a balloon and you take it and you're all screwed up for like a short period of time. It's not good for your brain. Often you see these others used by younger children because they can get their hands on glue or paint or whatever that they can sniff or huff. Problem is, these are usually things that are not meant to be inhaled. Sometimes kids will be inhaling or huffing paint and they get paint in their lungs and they basically suffocate themselves. You can figure out why that's a negative. Okay. We've gone through these different things. I'm trying to think of what else I want to make sure that I cover here. Okay, so theories and treatment. To prevent heroin relapse, clinicians may use one or more of these different medications: methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone. These are all used for heroin. CBT is really widely understood to be crucial in successful treatment, okay? We use a lot of motivational therapies also to go along with the CBT. We also have this non-substance related disorders. And the one that we focus on is gambling disorder. But gambling disorder seems to have that same pull as people who are addicted to substances. Okay? There is this, if we think about conditioning and reward systems with gambling, it is, if I just pull the lever one more time, maybe that's it. Okay, well, that didn't work. So maybe just the next time, and just the next time, and just the next time. And if I walk away, what if the next person gets it and they get the thing? I want to be that person, so I'm just going to stay for one more, just for one more, just for one more, right? And they leave and they have the craving to go back and do it just one more time. They have this increasing need to engage in the behavior, no matter what the negative social consequences are, right? So they may lose a relationship. They may lose all their money, and they yet still feel this intense pull to do it. It should also sound to you kind of like an obsessive compulsive thing, but we categorize it here in our non-substance related substance use disorders, right? Okay. People with gambling disorder have high rates of comorbidity, so they're also often using tobacco or nicotine dependence, other substances. Often people have mood disorders or anxiety disorders. Okay. Mood and anxiety disorders are more likely to come before rather than follow the onset of gambling disorder. One thing that we use for the gambling disorder is something called the pathways model. This is an approach to gambling disorder that predicts that there are three main paths leading to three subtypes, and that is genetic vulnerability interacts with poor coping and problem-solving skills of the person with the gambling disorder. Okay, this makes the individual particularly susceptible to early gambling experiences. So, pathways model, you can read more about that in your book. And then also we just have this genetic vulnerability. Okay, last thing here, just like all the other stuff, we like to look at the biopsychosocial perspective. Various treatment programs for people with substance-related disorders have emerged. Biological treatments with prescriptions seem helpful. Behavioral treatment involves techniques such as contingency management. That's what I mentioned before about, using appropriately or in moderation. Cognitive behavioral therapy and relapse prevention. So a combination of all of these things seems best. Now, the combination costs money, and this is where we end up with people who are addicted to substances, who really struggle to quit, and don't really have the resources that they need in order to be successful. All right, so on that positive note, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. That's all I need to say about this chapter.